that the Boston College Bookstore has copies of a number of books by our speakers at the table on the way out. There's a 20% discount. There's scholarly books, but for people who might look for a way to continue the conversation with yourself and with friends, the most recent book is Claire Will's memoir on cultural history, Missing Persons, My Grandmother's Secrets, or My Grandmother's Secrets. I really want to recommend it. If you'd like to continue knowing about this part of Ireland's past and present, I'd really recommend it to you. But all of the books there might be of interest. So I mentioned that I'd say a few things. I won't give extensive biographies because I think we all want to have a conversation about the film that we just watched. But of course, it's such a wonderful pleasure to have all of our speakers, and in particular to have Margo Harkin with us. Many of us have known her work, and I'd like to maybe ask you to join me. A storied career that I could talk about at length. Some highlights. I've just mentioned Margo has an MFA from the Ulster College of Art and Design. Amongst her many other roles, she worked for Field Day Theatre in Derry and did the set design for Brian Friel's The Communication Court, a little known fact. We've known about her film work since Mother Ireland was banned. One of the first treatments of republicanism and Republican and feminist politics put into conversation with each other. Many of us will remember Hushabye Baby, that very important movie about teenage pregnancy in Derry and on both sides of the border indeed. But Margo, I think it's fair to say, is most renowned and best known for her documentaries chronicling the Troubles in Northern Ireland, and in particular the two films, The Hunger Strike in 2006 and Bloody Sunday, A Derry Diary, also 2006. We're very pleased to have Margo on this campus. Dr. Sarah Ann Buckley from the History Department of University College Galway is, amongst many other things, she's the author of The Cruelty Man, Child Welfare, the NSPCC and the State in Ireland, 1889 to 1956, published by Manchester University Press, copies of which are on the table outside. But I think many of our speakers today... Oh yeah, exactly. So, Margo, Sarah Ann. But Sarah Ann, like Maria and like many of us who work in these areas, they cross over between academic work, activist work, and work that's public-facing. And I just want to indicate that in a couple of ways. In Sarah Ann's case, she is the, amongst many other things she does, she's the co-principal investigator of the Tuam Oral History Project at University College Galway. And she's also the co-author of a recent report, Language, Terminology and Representation Relating to Ireland's Institutions Historically Known as Mother and Baby Homes, County Homes and Related Institutions, published by the UNESCO Child and Family Research Centre at the University of Galway. Mairead Enright is joining us from the UK, from the University of Birmingham's Law School, where she is a professor of feminist legal studies, and has written on issues including reproductive justice, law reform, grassroots organising, illegality in social movements, responses to historical injustice, and obstetric violence. I just, by indicating that range of work, her recent articles might include articles on abortion and constitutional rights in Ireland, charitable bequests, reparation and Ireland's Magdalen laundries, state legal responses to historical institutional abuse, and national time, trauma, and legacies of sufficiotomy. Like Sarah Ann, Mairead and Sarah Ann have both appeared before Dáil Éireann, the Irish Parliament, and spoken in front of committees advocating for survivors' access to their information and for access to wider archives. So again, academics who work in between university space and the public sphere. It's lovely to welcome back Professor Claire Wills to BC, a friend of Irish Studies. Claire is the King Edward VII Professor of English Literature in the Faculty of English at Cambridge University, also in England, obviously. She writes about social, cultural and literary history of Britain and Ireland in the 20th century. If I was to recommend one of her books, the book I keep going back to is perhaps the best study of Irish cultural history in the mid-20th century, That Neutral Island, A Cultural History of Ireland Since the Second World War. Claire has also written 2 books about the Irish in Britain, and most recently is the author of a memoir, Cultural History, again, Missing Persons or My Grandmother's Secrets. And again, copies of all of our speakers' books are on the table outside. Finally, last but not least, Boston College is very proud to host Ms. Patricia Carey, the Irish government's special advocate for survivors of institutional abuse, on her first visit to the United States. In previous roles, Patricia served as the CEO of the Adoption Authority of Ireland, and I'm not putting her on the spot, but I think it's safe to say that without Patricia Carey, the Birth Information and Tracing Act, which came into law in October 2022, I almost said 1922, 2022, it just would not have happened. And with that act, adopted people in Ireland, for the first time, are given a statutory right to access their personal information, their birth certificate, on their early life. As an adopted person, born in a mother and baby institution herself, Patricia Carey brings a unique perspective and dedication to her work. And because members of the public are here, again, I want to reiterate what was said earlier. She welcomes anyone affected by these issues to reach out and get in touch and speak with her, or speak with Alyssa, who's also here from her office, and happy to share contact information and continue a conversation. Okay, question. I'm going to ask one question and only one question, and then the floor is open. It's 6:45 if my eyes are not failing me. I want to try and get to 7:30, maybe a little bit after, because we have to feed these people tonight. My first question appropriately goes to Margo. And Margo, a little obvious, we've talked about it before. But would you like to share with members of the audience your conversations, if any, with members of the Catholic religious orders who ran these institutions, or with the Catholic hierarchy in the making of this film?
Yeah. Well, yeah, a lot of people ask this question, why did I try to interview the nuns? Can't hear me? All right. I can't project.
Can't hear.
Oh, is this not this? All right, okay. Is that better? Yes, I'm sorry, I'm terrible. Yeah. The filmmaker, all right, okay. All right. Yeah, lots of people asked, did I make any attempt to contact the religious orders and the nuns? And I did, because when you make a feature documentary like this, generally you're going for multiple sources of funding. But one of my sources of funding was RTE, Radio Televís Éireann, which is a national broadcaster in Ireland. And they are obliged, because they're a public service broadcaster, to try and balance their output. You can either balance through individual programmes, you'd have contrary points of view, or you can balance on your overall schedule. You might have one subject which is very pro an issue, another contra that issue. So my commissioning editor, who was lovely, she put me under a lot of pressure to find nuns. And I had already been trying to find nuns and couldn't. I said, I can't get anybody to talk to me. And she said, no, it's not good enough, you have to try. So I'm really, really, really trying. I was chasing nuns all over there. And it was very hard because, first of all, a lot of them are elderly or have died. Like, for example, Sister Paul, who's interviewed in that footage, that was made by the LARC team, which was run by priests, a brilliant actual company that they had. They did great programs. And I took a long time trying to find her, but her order eventually told me that she had died. So I wanted to tell her out of courtesy more than anything. I wasn't going to interview her just to tell her she was in the film. But I also tried very hard to get nuns to talk to me, and Keeling Hogan, who was, she's a tall woman with the long hair who read the poem, from her book, Republic of Shame, about how the bishops got funding to set up a maternity unit at Bessborough, Motherby Home, or not Bessborough, Sean Ross and Ross Cray, and in County Tipperary. And she was my main source of contacts in the film. I mean, we had lots, but she was a really good source because of her book, and she'd already done this. And she tried her best. She gave me, like, for example, this is just an example, she gave me the name of a nun from a religious order, St. Pat's, which this nun was from Derry, and she thought the fact that I was from Derry might actually help open doors, and it did. And I had a great conversation with this nun, lovely conversation, but no, she couldn't talk about this issue. And but she remembered it, she talked a wee bit about it. She said she remembered the girls so well, and she loved them, and she loved going in to look at the babies. And this was kind of in contrast to some of the horrific stories that has been told, which are not in the film. I've left so much out. Anyway, she referred me upwards to another nun who was a historian. She didn't want to talk, she wasn't allowed to talk. But eventually it ended up that I was referred to the head of that order, who had now retired and had moved to another home. And she was quite elderly, and I chased her for so long, I really did. And I don't know whether she was avoiding me or whether it was incompetence, but I was editing at the time, and I was desperate to get someone to talk to me. And I would say, we tried to arrange a call, and I said, the only time I can't take a call from you is this particular hour when I'm travelling around, you know, the road that circles around Dublin, the M50, whatever it's called. Don't call me between the hour of 6 and 7 or whatever it was. She always called for that period. So I don't know if that was deliberate or if it was incompetence. It might have just been incompetence, you know, so I don't you can become a conspiracy theorist very rapidly, as some as you don't know. So, but I persisted. I would follow up both with phone calls, leaving messages, and emails, and eventually her PR person for the order wrote back and said, basically told me to stop harassing her, you know, and that's what it must have felt like to her, that I was harassing her. And I tried several other options. I talked to this really lovely man who was newly appointed to his job, he was in the missions, and he was very open and very eager to please. He wasn't at all, you know, he wasn't negative towards me. And he really tried as well to get me somebody, but nobody would talk. Nobody would talk from the bonds and curs. They just said, you know, the people that were involved in trade were all long dead. I'm sure you've had similar experience, haven't you? And then so this guy told me, well, I said, I've got to talk to somebody. And he said, well, the best thing is to go to the top. Go to the top. Go to Archbishop Aidan Martin. And he gave me his PR number. And I phoned his PR person. I forgot his name, Michael something. And he could not wait to get me off the phone. Really could not wait to get me off the phone. And said to me, look, BBC has done this interview with Archbishop, the one that little part of the picture of the film. He said, go and look at that and use whatever you want of that. And he's not going to say anything more than he says in that, because he's been very forthright in that, pardon me, in terms of his apology. And I said, well, okay, I'll do that. I'll go and look at that. But and that was actually he was interviewed around. It was after the Irish report had come out, and they'd done the preliminary report for you know, it was calling for the establishment of a commission of inquiry in the north, and he was responding to that on BBC Northern Ireland. And I said, so if I do that, are you satisfied that, you know, you've been offered your right to reply? Because that's what I was trying to do, to give them a chance to respond to these things that the woman was saying. He said, yes. Just could not wait to get me off the phone. And that's what we did. And so we really did try, is all I can say. You know.
Very good. Thank you, Margo. So I'm going to open it up. I'm sure there are questions. We have 2 microphones. If you raise your hand, we'll bring a microphone to you. Up at the very back, Rachel.
Thank you all. My question is really for Marie, and it was in relation to the kind of end section of the film in regards to oral testimony and the issues regarding oral testimony. And I understand that when the report was released, many working specifically in oral histories of this particular programme, the Oral History Network of Ireland released a statement saying that the lesion of these things is basically tantamount to an ethical issue because you're disregarding what so many people would find to be the key historical resource in understanding this. Can you just expand on that issue a little bit more, but also, was there maybe some disheartened feeling amongst people who had given their testimony that I've taken the time, the courage, and all the ethical issues in doing that to then have this not be placed in the historical record, and issues with historical oral testimonies being basically taken away?
Yeah, I can summarise the question before I respond. So the question is just about a significant number of survivors. Am I audible? A significant number of survivors gave testimony to the State's Commission of Inquiry, which produced this report before Margo's documentary was made. And I think, as I say in the documentary, there were two routes to being heard by the Commission. One is the investigative committee, and the other is the confidential committee. And the idea of a confidential committee sounds okay on the surface. The Mother and Baby Homes Commission is not the first commission. The first serious one in this set of experiences, I suppose, was the Ryan Commission of Inquiry into the Industrial Schools. And a lot of people who had been through that process said, correctly, that they found it traumatizing, stressful, degrading to participate in a heavy legalistic process, because they would go in and, let's say, the Christian Brothers or whatever religious order ran the institution that they were in would be fully lawyered up, and they would be cross-examined, often in very degrading terms. And so the function of the confidential committee is to give people a route so that they can give testimony without being treated in that way. Now, that's a false binary, right? The state has a range of different choices open to it. It's not either be battered by our expensive senior counsel or have your testimony disregarded completely. But whatever happened in the design of the Commission of Investigation, due regard was not paid to that question of how can you treat people ethically but still give weight to their testimony. And organisations like the Clan Project, which is closely associated with Justice for Magdalene's research and so on, they and their lawyers tried to stay in dialogue with the Commission while it was ongoing. One thing that they did that was, on reflection, showed extraordinary foresight, was they formally took statements from people, effectively affidavits, and those affidavits were sent to the Commission, and those are the only people whose testimony was reflected with any degree of accuracy in the report, and those are the only people whose testimony, because it jumped that legal hurdle, could be treated as evidence in an equivalent way to records created by the religious orders or records created by the state. But what I want to say, the government will often talk about legalism. We want to avoid legalism, we want to avoid adversarialism. And so we're going to treat people in all of these kinds of soft ways. But what Maeve O'Rourke would say, and I think she's right, is that the state has created this grey zone for survivors of institutional abuse, where they are not entitled to their full rights. I mean, the case that Margo mentioned, or that's mentioned in the text at the end of the documentary, the case that was taken to the High Court by 4 survivors, where they said, look, the statute that established the Commission says that anyone who's recognisable from the text of an output of the Commission should get to see that report in draft in advance. The religious orders saw the report in draft, they got to make submissions. Survivors who were recognisable, even from the anonymised text, did not get the same opportunity. There's a scene in the report, for those of you who've seen the movie Philomena, there is a scene that is instantly recognisable to anybody who's seen the film. Anyone who knew Philomena's story could have recognised her from the text. She was not given an opportunity to see that report in advance. So, I mean, even to talk about what happened at the level of oral history and methodology is giving it too much dignity. What happened was people were promised a process that would have learned the lessons of previous processes, that would treat them fairly and with dignity, and what they got was a very narrow, legalistic approach that discounted the vast majority of the testimony. And I think, you know, the report, and I'll shut up after this, but it's, you know, one of the things that Sarah Ann and others are doing, we can't let that report count as the official history. That's why this documentary and others like it are so important. We have to keep creating forums for people. Those stories you heard are the same stories the Commission heard. And the Commission came up with very different conclusions to what most of us and most of you will have come up with, because they created rules to allow them to disregard the vast majority of that truth. So we can talk about that, just that process all night, but that report cannot be allowed to stand, and it's so important that it's been challenged at multiple different levels.
But Maureen,
Yeah.
what you're not saying there is that you and your colleagues have written a separate report based on a kind of alternative summary.
Yeah,
based on many of the same.
Yeah, so a really small point. We got a bunch of legal academics together and we looked at the same evidence the Commission had, and we rewrote the findings, just the executive summary. And
Absolutely brilliant.
But the only thing we did, just to talk about law, because there's law and law, right? The only thing we did differently than the Commission in terms of legal analysis was we treated survivors of the institutions in the present moment, and as they were as children and as young women, as if they were subjects, citizens of a state which did have a constitution. And for all that De Valera did, a constitution that had protection for the family, protection for children whose parents were not married, and a right to liberty, a right to freedom from forced labour, right to education. You know, and that's all we did. We treated Ireland's international and domestic rights obligations seriously. The Commission didn't, because the state has gotten very used to putting these issues in a different legal space that is entirely of its creation and entirely of its invention.
And I think it says something else, that the state felt that they could allude to and refer to someone as internationally renowned as Philomena Lee. We all knew her. The report and the writers of the report knew that she would be recognised, but they didn't anticipate that she would challenge, and she challenged along with my good friend Mary Steed and Mary Harney and others. And the reason why Maeve and Claire McGettrick invented the Clan Project, where we would use lawyers to notarise individual survivors' testimony, was precisely because the interim of the three investigations, the one into Magdalene Laundries, our group, JFM, came up with 796 pages of fully transcribed survivor testimony, submitted it to the Macaleese investigation, and zero, not a single reference, not a single quote appeared. So, but the state is not the only people who can learn from these processes. We as academics and as advocates and as activists also learned, and I think that's how Clan became a problem and a sore point for the Commission of Investigation to Mother Baby Homes. Next questions. Other questions. This gentleman here. Johanna,
The institutions get closed down, were all these institutions closed down before the King's Light, or in some?
No.
1998.
The last 2006, Keelan has.
There was two
yeah. So the question that was asked was whether or not all of these institutions had closed down, and whether they are all closed down.
I mean, formally, the institutions, there's named institutions and unnamed, and I think it's really important to recognise the Commission looked at 14 mother and baby homes, 4 county homes. There was a network of almost 200. And so we're talking 98 and 2006. And the state won't recognise most of those institutions for redress. It's less than 30. So people who were born in private nursing homes, trafficked, paid for, sold, illegally adopted, not recognised.
Next question. The young gentleman up the back in the red shirt.
I just wanted to say that there was a home, like a place where women went to have children, one married woman, just over the border in Newton and Cunningham. Oh, you would know Mary rather than her husband. So as recent as that was very recent. Was that the 2006 one?
Castle, the castle.
The
Yeah.
castle.
Work away.
Thank you all for. Thank you all for coming. I had a question about your experiences with Catholicism and religion, or if you've spoken to any people about that, and kind of reconciling this relationship between religion and kind of practicing that today, but also reconciling with what has happened with the church in the past, and kind of having this relationship and, you know, being able to have a religious identity while also understanding that these things in the past have gone on.
Thanks, Margo. The historian comes in now. I can give my personal perspective, but I'll give a historical context first. Certainly there has been secularization in Ireland. It has occurred a lot more since a lot of these scandals have emerged publicly. But there's been individuals writing about their experiences, fighting against legislation, against a patriarchal and misogynistic nation, which I'm 40 and I know it. So certainly people older than me know it. I never speak on behalf of survivors, but I can tell you what has been said in some of the testimony, and it's that they can separate their faith from that institution. And I should say there are the Church of Ireland, as Margo points out, there's a smaller number of institutions, but there was similar neglect and abuse in the Bethany Home, in West Bank Orphanage, in many others.
Church of Ireland is Protestant.
We can do Protestant, yeah, Protestant. And if you talk about exclusion, they were excluded from Ryan Commission, excluded from others. Like, as a historian of modern Ireland, you know, I have to go from Catholic emancipation up to the present time. And students of mine still don't fully believe, younger students, you know, how do you mean that homosexual acts were criminalised till 1993, that a husband could rape his wife until 1993 legally, that we have had all of these at a time when the state turns over and it's 93% Catholic. So I don't know if I've answered like on a personal level, like personally, I am not a member of the Catholic Church, although I was baptised. And I'm not fully comfortable with the school system still being under their majority control. And I'm not fully comfortable with the networks and watching some of the treatment of survivors over the last number of years. So that would be my jet-lagged answer.
If I might say briefly in respect of redress, the Irish government has sent somebody to negotiate with the Roman Catholic Church, negotiate, as if it's a, could we have some money towards what you did? And the negotiations, quite frankly, are not going very well. There's a secondary issue that there are significant numbers of records that are still in the hands of religious and private individuals that have to be handed over. And I think a lot of survivors and affected people, over 50% talk to me about where are my records, that it's odd that the state is negotiating to get their records and to get money for redress. And it's not just money for redress from mother and baby institutions, they're still waiting for the Catholic Church to pay up for child abuse in industrial and reformatory institutions. So we have a long road to travel. But as Sarah Ann said, a lot of survivors and affected people, and I think it's a testimony to their resilience, still remain staunchly Christian and in some instances Catholic.
And just add in the Magdalen Laundries that 4 religious orders contributed 0 to the state's ex gratia redress fund. Next question.
Can I just say that Mary Moriarty in the film is a traveller woman, and she had this big statue of the Virgin Mary, which we filmed a lot, full of rosary beads, very particular kind of traveller iconography. And so I asked her, I said, you know, I can't really cope with not cope. I can't really kind of understand this juxtaposition. You know, what are you? Because she was telling me so many awful stories about the church that are not in the film, about especially how they treated traveller children. One story was a nun broke the jaw of a young girl because she was a traveller girl. Like, poor people were treated so badly, travellers were treated the worst of the worst. And that a local doctor had to remove her and protect her. I mean, it was vicious what they did. And I said, how are you still, professing your faith? And she says, no, I make a complete difference, just like you said. They separated their faith and their belief in God from the way the religious orders behaved. And just on a personal note, I gave up my religion when I was in my teens, so I don't practice. But I have family who are Catholic, and you have to be tolerant. I respect their faith, and I wouldn't do anything to dissuade them, you know. So, I'll say my best friend is that. Lots of my best friends are Catholics and Catholics.
Other questions? Yeah, up here on the right.
Hello. Sorry. Thank you so much for being here. I appreciate it a lot. Would you say that now in politics and political in Ireland, is there still a lot of church and state? There's still a lot of intervention in between them. And I also had another question was whether a lot of these institutions are still happening, or if there's something similar happening now.
So church-state relations in 2024 and similar types of institutions in the present.
Can I say a really quick one on that, because our law term, so our judicial system went back in last week, this week, and the opening of the judicial year is marked with a Roman Catholic Mass. And they parade in through the biggest church in Dublin. And our Attorney General is there, and I thought, well, that's giving a really clear message, answer to your question.
I might come at that question from a slightly different perspective. I've been in the States for a couple of weeks, and I'm feeling that I'm in a country where there's a very strong link between church and state, and it's worrying me. You can't hear me? As Sarah Ann said, in Ireland there's been a very fast process of secularisation since the 1990s, and one of the odd things is how out of step, in a way, Ireland is with other countries such as Italy, Hungary and the United States, where the situation is becoming more theocratic and reproductive rights are under more threat. I would also say that, I live in Britain and we don't have a problem with the Catholic Church, except in a small way, I suppose. There's still misogyny in the Catholic Church, wherever it is. But the role of the state and social services in controlling women's lives and in problematic ways is in non-religious countries as well. Sorry, I found it extremely moving watching the film. I've seen it 4 times now, and I was completely overwhelmed all over again at the misery and sadness that is just still ramifying. And we talk about survivors, and there are so many survivors, not just the survivors who are in the homes, but all those people who've lost their relatives. I find it I'm finding it very difficult to speak, in fact, because it's too disturbing. And it will happen again here. It will happen here. If you get rid of reproductive rights, you are going to have mother and baby rights.
Mairead would be more. I've never needed a microphone before, so this was interesting. Mairead would be more qualified in this, but the point in the film is when single mothers' allowances came in 1973, and when other welfare measures that allow you to be a single parent are supported, then we never needed these institutions, but we certainly don't need them anymore. So there are developments that have occurred in Ireland, there's social change that has occurred, we have a ways to go. A lot of us were involved, Mairead was a lot more involved, but in repeal the 8th Amendment, but like I still in Galway drive past the corner where the hospital's across the road, which I can't imagine is far enough an exclusion zone for the signs and the religious signs that I see when women are going in to, because they've had miscarriages, they're having DNCs, whatever it is. So we still have, some of those issues, I think, yeah, but Mairead.
Mairead, you go first.
Oh, yeah, okay. So the question was about, the second question about the continuation of those institutions, like do we still have, and of course we do still have certain kinds of residential institutions in Ireland today, and perhaps one of the best known is our immigration detention system, and of course you have equivalent institutions here. Look, power is always shifting, right? The ways in which power operates is always shifting. The church does not have the same kind of institutional power in Ireland that it used to have. But when you have inculcated a population with a certain kind of morality, cradle to grave, generation to generation, you will still find residues of that power. The abortion law is an example. I was involved in the campaign to get the fetal life provision out of the Constitution, and the fetal life provision was called the 8th Amendment, and that was the constitutional provision that made it almost impossible to get an abortion in Ireland, even if you would die. But I know that in several states in the US, you're playing out that experience again here. But yes, we got that out of the Constitution, but the legislation that we passed is still very restrictive. After 12 weeks, you have to jump through a range of hoops. In practice, there are certain kinds of abortion that you just can't get in Ireland, and you still have to travel to England or other jurisdictions. You still need a doctor's permission, and after 9 weeks since your last menstrual period, you're going to a hospital to deal with obstetricians and so on. And so the level of access that we have, the reason I get into the abortion issue is there is no bishop now in any hospital saying that woman can't have this healthcare. But what there is the residues of expectation, the moral residues that colour medical practice, and that also coloured the attitude of our elected politicians in refusing to pass legislation that would have been, our legislation mirrors legislation that was passed in European countries in the 1960s and 1970s, because our governments looked at every other European country and said, we'll go for the middle. Not we're going to be, we had this big story about what a trailblazing secular feminist country we were, but that's not what our law looks like, and there are myriad other examples. And I think the one place where the church still has power, and I'm not sure that this is any individual priest or bishop or whatever, but I make a habit of reading Oireachtas debates in detail, right, because that's my job. And one of my standard codes is defending the church. So people will start a speech, even people who are big supporters of survivors will say, look, we must acknowledge the role that religious charities play in Ireland. They educated us and they ran our hospitals and all of this kind of thing. And of course that is true to some extent, but only because a particular structural relationship with the church was built up and alternatives were suppressed. So there is this idea of, people will say, my uncle's a priest, my aunt's a nun, the nuns taught me, the nuns were very good to me. And there's that catch still, that we cannot hold this very powerful and wealthy set of institutions accountable because there's such an effective and moral grip. I'm not a practicing Catholic, I'm not a practicing Catholic. I'm living the kind of life that women in both sides of my family generations ago could not have imagined in terms of the extraordinary freedom that I enjoy. But at the same time, any time I deal with these kind of issues, there's still the tiny little voice in the back of my head that says, that's Satan, your mama wouldn't like that, your nana wouldn't like that. And that stuff, I know just Joanne Neary, whose mother told the social worker to fuck off, right? But Joanne is the product of 4 4 generations of strong women telling the church to fuck off. And what I find most moving, and I find it so moving during the Queen, was people my age and Sarah Ann's age, who were deliberately raising their children like that little girl. To say, that happened, I know that happened to my mum. And I am confident, I feel safe that nothing like that will ever happen to me. And I think that's extraordinary, that's going to be the work of generations. It's going to be the work of generations to get that middle out of the system.
And generations across the civil service, generations across the medical profession, generations across the legal profession, generations across the social welfare
And
profession.
it's happening faster for working class families than for the respectable families. Like, that's one of the big catches.
So Mary Murphy here, a wonderful new colleague, Mary Murphy from DC.
Thanks very much indeed. It was a harrowing watch, I have to say, so I share your emotion in terms of speaking about it, but it was also a very powerful piece of work, so I commend you all for your contribution to it. We've talked a lot about the role of the church and the state, but there's one other sector, and it's the private sector, the corporate sector, which is implicated as well in the documentary. Could you say a word about that sector and the way in which they have been perhaps freed from responsibility, at least in the public domain, at least?
What do you mean by the corporate sector?
Glaxo.
Well, I can speak to that. I've had a number of people contact me to send photographs of their disfigured bodies, and they have been told there's a standard report that they receive from GlaxoSmithKline, and the Irish government has ceased to try to negotiate, to debate, to even discuss the full extent of what happened and reparations for those people. So I believe that's the next. Unfortunately, it is a battle for survivors and affected people, because it seems the last 20 years has been a battle. And I think it's regrettable that the state, and it does go back to the state, are asking people, in order to receive redress, to sign a legal waiver that they will not take any further action. This is deliberate, because they know the next thing coming down the tracks is going to be the investigation into vaccine trials. And people who desperately need money for a new front door, or to fix their car, or to pay a bill, are taking 12,000, who are maybe in a mother and baby institution for 4 years, poor health care, and they have to sign a waiver with these scars on their body, not knowing what happened. It's unbelievable.
And just to connect the dots, it's the same government who, as was said earlier, wants to negotiate with the church for redress rather than demand redress. The same government that refused to sue Apple for 15 billion worth of capital gains tax that was not paid. The Irish government was embarrassed to go after it. And it's the same government who's not suing GlaxoSmithKline, a global conglomeration, on behalf of the survivors who are citizens of our country. So join the dots. Other questions? In the middle here.
Thanks again for speaking and being present. I'm just curious about thinking about kind of layers of ancestral trauma that we kind of carry. I was thinking of Claire, who spoke in New York, and we were talking a bit about that with your sort of hybrid memoir. And, you know, we're talking very much in the 20th century and 21st century, which is, of course, the moment that's most resonant, but I'm thinking back about Sarah Ann's, you know, this talking about this history of founding institutions and some of the work that Mairead is kind of talking about. We had a colloquium yesterday, and even Claire, that you kind of referenced this weekend in New York at the ACES conference, that was thinking about that sort of layers of ancestral sort of carrying, that we unconsciously carry something, and we don't know whether it's belief or guilt or shame or just like, so I guess I'm thinking about that and just wondering if maybe some of the people who are historians or anyone would be willing to talk about that sort of idea in connection with sort of historical evolution of these founding institutions, and their obvious link that I'm not obviously the only one who's thinking about between colonial experience and then the Catholic Church, obviously, in the new state, taking that sort of role of power and renegotiate it. We're talking a lot about the Catholic Church, and like many, I was raised Catholic, I'm not anymore, and I'm not removing blame or anything by simply saying that I'm curious about this generational movement. I'm not sure if that makes sense. Thank you.
Claire, do you want to talk about your memoir first? And then
I don't think this works. So I've tried to write about exactly that in a kind of historical memoir that is looking at 4 or 5 generations of unmarried mothers or unplanned pregnancies and different ways in which they're managed. And one of the things that I think we need to think about is, separately from the kind of trauma of being inside an institution, is the way we carry shame inside ourselves. And this goes back to Mairead's kind of niggle at the back of her head. You know, I had a grandmother who was ashamed that she was pregnant in 1920, not married. And the way that passed on was her complete agonized shame when it happened in the next generation. And then the next generation is not ashamed of sex because, you know, it's not a Victorian generation anymore, but they're ashamed of their association with the institutions. And then my generation comes along and we're ashamed of trying to find out something about the institutions. We're ashamed of telling stories. And I guess I was really interested in the film, Mairead. You said the trouble with the confidential committee is it just becomes just stories. And we have to do something with the things that are just stories, because in fact that is the key to understanding our own relationship to this. It is through the stories that we can access our own investment, the way we carry this in our own bodies. And I was very moved for the 4th time watching the film and seeing all the creative writing that you've put into the film. It's such a beautiful film. The landscapes and the kind of those scenes from above interrupt these traumatic stories. And at the same time, we get different interruptions. We get interruptions from creative writers who are twisting the stories to do something else with them. You know, these are stories of violence which we have to turn around, take hold of the story and reuse it as those creative writers do. I mean, obviously, I'm not saying that the redress and the legal stuff that's vital. But in addition, if we're to work out our own relationship to this, we have to do this story work. I'm not sure if that's an answer, but it's where I would begin to go to look for an answer.
Thanks, Claire. This lady here. I told you nothing happens without Rachel.
Through the generations have passed down a spirit of defiance as well.
Yeah, I think like there's intergenerational trauma, but there is, you know, like I wouldn't be probably like speaking the way me and Mairead are now. Even 10 years ago, I didn't feel very comfortable in academia speaking that way, because back to the oral history question, like I think oral history and oral history testimony holds every bit of weight of some document that some civil servant put into an archive, but other people don't believe that. So, because this question of memory and, you know, so I think sometimes we have to re-question our whole, and just that methodology, but I think there's something to be said about how there's a certain generation, you know, that are, maybe were involved in an activist way and are kind of saying, you know, no, actually. But now,
This is riveting. I usually think of these things in terms of race, and we were talking about how we carry things in our body, and how Black and brown people have these chronic conditions. It's like, wow, I wonder what's the problem here. And then we find out, violence over hundreds of years, and the chronic inflammation that causes, and just as you said, the intergenerational trauma. Obviously, there are people that have direct scars because of the vaccine testing, illegal vaccine testing, but I wonder sometimes, can we see, even in the last, you said it's like several generations, is there kind of evidence of this hurting people's health? And that's just, I'm wondering if there's any kind of correlation. Has anyone noticed that, or is there any evidence of it?
you should take that, Julie.
There is evidence that concealed pregnancy, even at full-term births, children were born underweight, significantly underweight. So women concealed the pregnancy for as long as they could, and then someone found out and they were put into an institution. So those children, as we know, children born underweight have lifelong. We know that addiction issues, low educational attainment, lack of access to adequate housing, healthcare, that all of those people, and people who are in multiple institutions, are intergenerational institutionalization. So they're always playing catch up. And then going back to my mantra of, then the state provision of healthcare is less than adequate. So one of the things now that we're, I suppose, battling for is that younger survivors and affected people would have access to free healthcare through not an enhanced medical card, but a full range of healthcare services, which, as you said, that there is a correlation to health outcomes and race and those who are in institutions.
I might add, so I can't help not thinking of my friend Mary, who's going to be buried at 64, and the journey of her life, where it started, malnutrition, lack of care, the trauma of being put on a plane at 18 months, arriving in another country, and all that ensued. And Mary was very open about it. Her evidence, her testimony is out there, and you can. I mentioned Mary's mother, Josephine. Mary herself became an unmarried mother at 15, and Mary's daughter, who was born when she was 16, was a fourth generation unmarried mother. But I also think of Catherine Whelan, the survivor who was here in Boston, who called me in my office here at Boston College and started me on this journey. And Catherine lived the last 20 years of her life in excruciating back pain. She was here in America, so she was excluded. That's one of the words around Irish redress: exclusion, and excluded communities, excluded because you're a member of the diaspora. She couldn't access healthcare, even when it was introduced 5 months before she died in 2016. She wasn't eligible because she lived here in the United States. But Catherine would say that when she went in at 14 years of age to a convent that also had an industrial school for children, but Catherine was put in with a population of adult women and worked without pay in a Magdalene laundry until she turned 19, that she was hungry for 5 years. And those are key years in the development of a young woman. She's, in her public testimony, which is available online, she experienced menstruation for the first time when she was 17. She worked on a mangle, lifting heavy, hot steam laundry through an electric dryer, an industrial dryer. And when I knew Catherine much later in life, and when she travelled back to Ireland, she got her redress in 2014, and that she saved the bulk of her money so that she could be repatriated, and that she could arrange for her end of life. Her one indulgence was to buy a first-class ticket from Chicago to Ireland, because that was the only way she could make that journey. And she got off the plane, hunched over. So, yeah. Other questions? Maybe the last question, we're beyond. So Joyce, who's spent a life working on these issues. So Joyce, you're going to have the last question of the night. No pressure.
Really, what I have is a couple of comments. One directed to Claire in some ways, but to all of us. I do a lot of work in the psychology of adoption, and I do a lot of narrative therapy because I think that storytelling is so important. And one of the founders of narrative therapy, I love a quote that he said, his name is David White, and he said that narrative therapy is rescuing the telling from the told. The told is stagnant, but the telling can keep moving and keep changing. And that's what I think we have to keep doing. And then my next comment is, I don't know, maybe it's just because I'm crazy, but the last couple of weeks I feel a little bit of hope because China closed international adoptions. The Frontline film on Korea and the terrible treatment of babies and mothers, but and then this, really there's so much wrongdoing around adoption and around children's care and the lack thereof. So I'm just hoping that movies like this one, which is wonderful, will make a big difference. But also to be aware that Ireland isn't the only country. This is a worldwide problem. Women and infants are, possessions.
Joyce, I'm going to cut across you because I've just been told by Rachel that the young gentleman, the young student who's manning the book table outside has to be out of here at 7:30. He's agreed to spend an extra 10 minutes. So anybody who's interested in a copy of any of the books, go now, please. And others, can I ask you to please join me one more time and thank all of our speakers.
Thanks to James, Leah and Rachel and to all of you for